She told me to close the file, but I wanted her to open something far more guarded, her heart. The office had grown almost unnaturally quiet. Most of the staff had gone home hours ago, leaving only the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rattle of a distant elevator. My desk lamp threw a circle of warm light across the paperwork I'd been buried in all evening, the rest of the floor fading into muted shadows. I wasn't surprised to hear the click of her heels against the polished floor. My boss always stayed late. She moved with a kind of effortless poise, her dark blazer still perfectly fitted despite the long day. At 42, she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had been through more storms than she'd ever admit. Yet tonight, as she stopped at my desk, there was something faintly weary in her eyes. "Close the file," she said softly, her tone measured, almost maternal, as though she were telling me I had done enough. I looked up, catching the faint trace of fatigue at the corners of her mouth. The request was simple, practical. But behind it, I sensed something deeper, like she was telling me not just to close the file, but to step away before the weight of responsibility chained me the way it had chained her. For a moment I didn't move. I just studied her, her hair falling neatly around her shoulders, the faint reflection of the desk lamp catching in her eyes, revealing a flicker of vulnerability beneath her usual composed exterior. She was always in control, always carrying the weight for everyone else. But here, in this quiet hour, with no one left to watch, the cracks in her armor were visible. The file felt heavy in my hands, though it was nothing but paper. I thought about how many nights she had stood exactly where I was now, ordering herself to keep going long after her body begged for rest. Her voice lingered in the air, and I realized it wasn't a command as much as a plea. She wanted me to choose balance, to be smarter than she had been. And yet, something in her eyes told me she didn't want me to leave just yet either. The lamp buzzed faintly. My pulse picked up. The distance between us was small, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken: authority, respect, curiosity, and an almost magnetic pull I couldn't explain. I closed the file slowly, deliberately, but my gaze stayed on her, steady and searching. It wasn't the file that needed closing. It was the walls around her heart. The sound of the file closing echoed louder than it should have in the near-empty office, a soft thud that seemed to settle into the quiet like a heartbeat. She had expected me to obey, I could tell. She was used to people following her words without question. That was her role, confident, decisive, untouchable. But I couldn't resist. Maybe it was the long hours, maybe the loneliness of the dim office, or maybe it was the way her eyes had softened when she told me to close the file. Something stirred in me, something daring and uncharacteristic. "Only if you open your heart," I said lightly, almost teasing, but my voice carried a sincerity I couldn't disguise. The words lingered in the air between us, delicate yet dangerous, like a glass balancing on the edge of a table. For a fraction of a second, I worried I had gone too far. She was my boss, after all. A line existed between us, one that had always been clear, until tonight. She froze, just long enough for me to notice the faint hitch in her breath. Her perfectly composed posture faltered, shoulders easing as if I had cracked through something solid. Then, to my surprise, a soft laugh escaped her lips. Not the practiced, polite kind she often gave in meetings, but something quieter, unguarded, real. Her hand moved almost instinctively, smoothing the sleeve of her blouse, as though she needed something to do to ground herself. But her eyes didn't leave mine. There was a flicker there, part amusement, part challenge, and something else she wasn't ready to name. "You're bold," she murmured, her voice carrying a mix of warning and intrigue. I smiled faintly, feeling the charged air between us. "Maybe. Or maybe I just noticed the things you hide." Her lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but she stopped herself. She wasn't used to being seen, not beyond her title and authority. I had unsettled her, and I think, in some way, she liked it. The silence grew thick again, though it wasn't empty. The overhead lights hummed, the city traffic outside sounded faint and distant, but here, in this small pocket of space, it felt as though the world had shrunk down to just the two of us. Her laughter still hung in my ears, softer than the clicking of her heels, warmer than the glow of the lamp. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted. It was small, subtle, but undeniable. The wall she carried around herself had not fallen, but it had cracked. And I had been the one to place the first fracture. The office clock ticked steadily, marking the late hour, but neither of us moved. She leaned against the edge of my desk, a gesture I had never seen from her before. Normally, she stood tall, distant, commanding from her own space. But tonight, she closed the distance, almost as if gravity itself had drawn her nearer. Her eyes traced the scattered papers, though I knew she wasn't really looking at them. She was thinking. Wrestling. The kind of silence that carried the weight of something unsaid filled the room. "You think I'm unshakable, don't you?" she asked at last, her voice lower than usual. There was no edge, no authority. It was the sound of a woman setting down her armor, even if only for a moment. I tilted my head, studying her profile, the soft curve of her jaw, the way the lamplight touched the streaks of silver in her dark hair. "I think you carry more than you let anyone see," I said quietly. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. It was the kind of expression people wear when they've been caught telling a truth they never intended to share. She let out a slow exhale, folding her arms loosely across her chest, not in defiance, but almost in comfort. "You have no idea how many nights I've stayed here, drowning in these files," she murmured, glancing toward the stack as though they were old enemies. "People assume strength means never bending. But strength, sometimes it's just refusing to collapse where others can see." I leaned forward in my chair, resting my elbows on the desk, listening in the way I knew she needed. Not interrupting. Just offering presence. She hesitated, then continued, her words softer now, confessional. "I was married once. It ended years ago. People think time makes those wounds fade, but truthfully, it just teaches you to hide them better." Her eyes flickered toward me, searching, perhaps, for judgment. But I gave none. Only silence and steady attention. The city murmured faintly through the tall windows, horns, a siren in the distance, but inside the office, the world had narrowed again to just her voice and my heartbeat. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the dark skyline. "Funny, isn't it? I lead a team, I make decisions every day, and yet I haven't made peace with myself." I wanted to reach for her then, to place a hand over hers, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the space between us stay heavy, meaningful. Because sometimes, letting someone speak without filling the silence is the purest way of saying, "I see you. I hear you. You're not alone." And in that moment, she knew I wasn't just her subordinate. I was the first person in years who dared to look past the armor, straight into the heart she kept so carefully locked away. The weight of her words hung between us long after she stopped speaking. She had revealed more in a few minutes than I had ever imagined she would. Vulnerability looked different on her, it didn't weaken her presence, it deepened it. And I felt myself drawn closer, as if the quiet honesty between us had shifted the very air in the room. She straightened slowly, her arms unfolding, and reached for the stack of papers at the edge of my desk. The movement was casual, practical. But her hand brushed mine as she slid the file toward herself. The contact was brief. Yet, in that instant, the world seemed to still. Her skin was warm, softer than I expected, the touch delicate but charged. Neither of us pulled away immediately. It was the kind of touch that carried intent, not obvious, not reckless, but layered with everything unsaid. I felt my pulse quicken. Her hand lingered, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of mine before she finally withdrew, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as though to disguise the slip. Her breath caught, so faint, almost imperceptible. But I noticed. I lowered my gaze to the papers, then back to her face. The controlled mask she usually wore was cracked again, just slightly. There was a softness in her eyes, a question she didn't voice. The silence stretched. The hum of the overhead lights became louder in the absence of words. Outside, the glow of the city blurred against the glass windows, headlights moving like rivers of light far below. But here, the only thing I was aware of was the warmth still lingering on my skin where she had touched me. I leaned back in my chair, careful not to break the fragile spell. "That didn't feel like an accident," I said quietly, though my voice carried no accusation, only invitation. Her lips parted as if to respond, but she hesitated. Instead, she gave a faint smile, one that didn't fully reach her eyes. "Careful," she murmured. "You'll start to imagine things that aren't there." I wanted to laugh, but instead I shook my head slightly. "Or maybe I'll just notice the things you're too careful to admit." For a moment, she looked at me the way one looks at a door they've kept locked for years, hesitant, tempted, uncertain if opening it would bring relief or ruin. Her fingers pressed lightly against the stack of papers, but she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at me. And in her gaze, I saw something both fragile and fierce, a longing carefully disguised as restraint. The file remained between us, but it wasn't the real thing keeping us apart. Her gaze broke first. She shifted slightly, turning her shoulders away, as if the city skyline outside the wide windows suddenly demanded her attention. But I knew better. It wasn't the view that pulled her eyes away, it was the storm building inside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "This can't happen." The words were firm, yet there was no conviction behind them. They sounded rehearsed, like a rule she had told herself countless times before, a line she had sworn not to cross. She rubbed her palm along her sleeve, grounding herself. "I'm your boss," she continued, steadier now. "People would never understand. They'd twist it, judge me." I stood slowly, not to challenge her authority, but to lessen the distance. We were side by side now, the glow of the city spilling gold and silver across the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, composed, elegant, untouchable. But standing this close, I could see the truth, the faint tremble in her breath, the weight she carried in her eyes. "Maybe they would judge," I admitted softly, "but I don't care about them." She turned toward me, startled by the conviction in my voice. Her lips parted as though she wanted to scold me for my boldness, but she didn't. Instead, she searched my face, scanning for cracks, for hesitation. She found none. The silence between us thickened, a silence not of emptiness but of choices, heavy, impossible choices. Her hand drifted to the sill, fingers pressing against the cool glass. Mine hovered close, not touching, but near enough that the warmth of her presence brushed against my skin. "You're young," she said finally, shaking her head slightly. "You don't understand what it means to give people a reason to talk. I've worked too hard to build this reputation." Her voice wavered at the edges, betraying the steadiness she wanted to project. I let her words sink in, let the fear and the truth of them stand without resistance. But I didn't step back. My gaze stayed on hers, steady and patient. "I'm not asking for tomorrow," I said gently. "I'm asking for right now. Just this moment. No one else. No rules. Just you and me, as we are." Her breath hitched again. She pressed her hand more firmly against the window as if to keep herself upright. The city outside kept moving, unaware of the fragile war being fought inside this room. And for the first time, I saw her not as my boss, not as the woman who carried everyone else's burdens, but as someone standing on the edge of something terrifying and beautiful, trying to decide if she was brave enough to step forward. The city stretched endlessly below us, glittering with 1,000 lights, but in that moment it felt like nothing more than background noise. What mattered was here, the quiet office, the faint hum of electricity, and the fragile line between us that trembled with every unspoken thought. I stood beside her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle and refined, like jasmine carried on a warm breeze. She leaned one shoulder against the glass, her profile outlined in the gold glow of passing headlights. Her voice was soft, almost a confession. "Do you realize what you're saying?" I nodded. "I do. I'm saying I don't care about titles or rules. They're just words on paper. Hearts aren't meant to be kept in boxes." She exhaled sharply, the kind of breath that carried frustration and longing all at once. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered, shaking her head slightly. "But it isn't. I've lived long enough to know how quickly everything can fall apart." I let the words rest in the air before responding. "And I've lived long enough to know some things are worth the risk." Her eyes flickered toward me, searching, weighing. The silence pressed heavy, filled with the drumbeat of possibility. I didn't move closer, I didn't dare. Instead, I let my hand hover just beside hers on the windowsill, close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from me, far enough that she could still choose. Her gaze dropped to that small space between our hands, the inches that carried the weight of everything. I could see her battling herself, the instinct to retreat, the longing to stay. "I shouldn't," she murmured, almost to herself. "You don't have to," I said gently. "But you could." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world outside carried on, cars weaving through midnight streets, neon signs blinking against the dark. And then, slowly, cautiously, her fingers slid across the sill and into mine. The contact was fragile at first, her hand trembling faintly against my palm, as if she expected me to pull away. But I didn't. I closed my hand lightly around hers, steady, sure. She drew in a shaky breath, closing her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, there was something different there, something unguarded, almost luminous. It wasn't a surrender. It wasn't defeat. It was choice. The city lights painted her in gold, but it was the softness of her touch that lit something inside me. And in that stillness, I knew, we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Her hand rested in mine, light but steady, as though she were testing the strength of something new. For years, she had carried herself like stone, composed, unshakable. But here, beneath the glow of the city and the quiet hum of an empty office, she allowed herself to lean into something softer. Slowly, she pulled away, not from me, but from the window. She turned back toward the desk, the stack of files waiting in their usual silent demand. Her fingers grazed the cover of the one we had left unfinished earlier. Without a word, she closed it gently, sliding it aside. The sound was quiet, almost ceremonial, like the closing of a chapter she no longer needed to reread. When she looked at me again, there was a faint smile on her lips, one that carried no pretense. "You have no idea what you've done," she whispered, her tone not scolding, but reverent, as if she was both terrified and grateful. I stepped closer, careful, deliberate. "Maybe I do," I said softly. "Or maybe I just know that no one should have to keep everything locked away forever." Her eyes glistened, not tears, exactly, but the sheen of someone who has finally let herself breathe after holding it in too long. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over mine on the desk, pressing lightly. The touch was simple, but it carried more weight than words could hold. For the first time, I felt the steadiness in her, steady not because she was hiding behind authority, but because she was letting someone else see the truth of her. The office around us seemed transformed. The fluorescent lights, once harsh and demanding, now felt softer, warmer. The papers, the deadlines, the weight of leadership, all of it faded into the background. What remained was this, two people standing on the edge of something neither had expected but both quietly longed for. Her smile deepened, still delicate, but no longer unsure. "Maybe you're right," she admitted. "Maybe hearts aren't meant to stay locked." I covered her hand more firmly with mine, grounding her in the moment. "Then let's not lock this one." For a long moment, we stood there, no grand gestures, no declarations, just the quiet, unshakable understanding that something had shifted forever. The file was closed. The rules were still there, the world still waiting with its judgments and noise. But in that quiet office, with her hand resting in mine and her heart finally unguarded, I knew something had begun that no rule could ever contain. And it was enough.